Most trading card games last only 2 years. Time and time again, we see them make the same mistakes and crumble for the same reason, falling victim to the 7 deadly sins of trading card games. So, quiz time. What do you need for a game of chess, aside from an opponent, of course? Well, you need a board divided into an 8x8 grid of alternating squares and 2 differently colored sets of 16 pieces consisting of 8 pawns, 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, a king, and a queen. What about Monopoly? Well, you need a multicolored board, 8 character tokens, a set of property cards, a chance deck, a community chess deck, 32 houses, 12 hotels, 2 dice, and of course a buttload of fake money. And for a game of Doom? Let's just not get into that right now. Now in the inverse, what do you need to play poker? A deck of cards. Blackjack? A deck of cards. Go Fish? A deck of cards. Texas Hold'em? A deck of...
I think you can see what I'm getting at here.
Board games tend to be valued for their presentation, the meshing of a large assortment of pieces and rules that go together like a machine, and boardies wouldn't have it any other way. People like their board games to be kind of extravagant and bold, especially the ones designed for an immersive experience like Risk, and having a few extra pieces to boost the experience is often considered a good thing. Even the simpler games like Othello, Checkers, or Go have intricate board interactions. Card games, however, usually favor the simplicity of having just the cards. They don't have a lot of moving parts to them and are easy to start up and play, with the complexity coming more from the cards themselves rather than any sort of combination of parts and rules. Even larger games like Dominion, Cards Against Humanity, or Sentinels of the Multiverse have a pretty simple setup and execution.
They also aren't played on boards. I mean, yeah, pretty much every card game out there includes some sort of playmat for new players to work with, but these are basically the card game equivalent of training wheels, and once a player is used to how a card game is played, these can generally be disposed of. But if you make a game that requires a playmat because of how the cards are positioned on the field, kind of like pawn pieces, then congratulations, you've actually made a board game. But there are those games out there that seem to miss this distinction, or lean into this distinction too hard, or generally don't get it. Yeah, you can see how long this video is.
Now, at least in my regard, the most infamous one of these games is, of course, Redecai, seen previously in Sin Number 4. Redecai, a short-lived card game by Spin Master, uses clear cards with different open windows to indicate how the card works. Unfortunately, this has the side effect of preventing the cards from having uniform card backs, a must-have for any game using a randomized deck to keep the cards in the deck a secret. However, since that was impossible for Redecai to accomplish, the starter set also comes packaged with a darkened deck box, a card tray, and a hand-holding panel with a Kairu counter, Kairu being the game's resource which works basically like Hearthstone's mana crystals. But you notice something odd about this? None of these components, except charitably the Kairu tracker, actually serve an in-game function. It's just a bunch of junk developed in an effort to solve an unsolvable problem. And yes, I mean unsolvable. I mean, look at this. I can still see the top card of the deck. I know which type of card I'm getting next. This stuff is all literally garbage. And all of this garbage comes with a price. And the pricier your buy-in, the harder it is to get players to take the first step into your game. In a world where a typical game starter runs from $10 on the low end to roughly $18 on the high end, Redecai has a one-player buy-in of a whopping $30. All of this stuff, the stuff that doesn't actually have a game function, that's what basically tripled the cost of the starter deck.
I honestly have no idea why they tried to make such a cursed design work as a physical card game, and as a little bit of spice on top, they did make a pocket-sized carrying case for this game, but one small problem, your deck size is 43, but you know how many cards this thing can hold? 37, and that includes the little spot in the top here. But then they made a portable case that's supposed to be easier to carry around than this darn thing. One small problem, it's over a foot long.
They were also advertising this cube thing that I think never made it past prototype. What happened to this prototype, I wonder? I'd love to get my hands on it. While we're here, I might as well mention another card game with clear cards called Gloom. It's a self-contained game about misfortune that also has asymmetrical card backs. Thing is, it's a self-contained card game where everybody draws from the same deck, the backs are obscured so you can't really tell what sort of card you're getting, and all of the cards have the exact same design on the bottom, unlike Redecai, so a darkened box would actually work here. But here's where we get to the big issue with this sort of thing. It's not just the added complexity that can throw people off of a game, but a lot of added parts can affect inclusivity as well. A lot of folks who play card games aren't necessarily big fans of paying a huge cover fee or lugging around a ton of game components, and the simplicity that your average game provides, where you can just sleeve up a deck and plunk it into a little box with a life counter and a few tokens, has a large appeal to these sorts of people. But what about a game that doesn't suffer these severe design flaws? Let's take a look at Keyforge by Fantasy Flight Games. Keyforge is a game developed to simulate that feel of sealed and draft night, a concept in most trading card games where you build a deck using just the contents of a handful of booster packs rather than having access to every card in the game, forcing players to innovate new strategies while stuck with incomplete sets and suboptimal cards. To accomplish this draft-like sensation in Keyforge, Fantasy Flight sells decks that are unique, unchangeable, and randomly generated, complete with their own unique name and card back, forcing players to figure out the deck's strategies. Now that I think about it, Relentlessly Poor Elulu kinda sounds like the name of a magical girl character, doesn't it? Now, while I admit Keyforge isn't really my cup of tea, I can understand why it appeals to other types of players and generally don't have a problem with its design. However, it does give a really weird answer to a simple question.
How does a new player get into a trading card game? Well, they buy a deck of cards, right? No, stupid! What gave you that idea? The back of the box? Don't look at that! What you're supposed to do is drop $40 on the starter set.
So yeah, despite what the box literally says, you can't just nab any old Keyforge deck off the shelf to start playing. You need tokens. Keys, amber tokens, damage counters, stun counters, chain trackers, ward counters, health buff counters, etc.
I don't even think Mousetrap comes with this many different pieces.
Keyforge is awash with additional gobbledygook to the point that you can't actually just buy one of these decks to play. You have to either purchase a big ol' starter box to get the tokens you need, or pray that whoever shows up to play against you brought their set. This is kinda what I meant by Fantasy Flight making their games a bit too board gamey. They include a ton of additional components that increase the price of the game as well as all the stuff you have to lug around. I mean, it's not unreasonable to expect a deck to contain everything you need to play a game in it, even without the box saying so, as including the stuff needed to play a game beyond maybe a few common household knickknacks is standard operating procedure for basically every game ever.
Couldn't they have at least packed in some cards that you could flip over to function as keys, along with maybe like a lousy punch card of a few tokens? I mean, even Crossmaster in their single packs includes like a lousy little punch card of tokens, and that's a board game. Well, technically it's a miniatures game, but look at this setup, it counts.
Now, eventually Fantasy Flight released both a cheaper 2-player starter set and a 1-player deluxe deck which comes with their own smaller token sets, but the text on the back of the single decks is still misleading at best. I get that due to how Keyforge is designed, the cards can only be bought as decks, but maybe the back of the box should drop the all you need to play line and instead take this footnote that only appears further down after I've stopped reading to perhaps say players should start with a Keyforge 2-player starter set or deluxe deck.
So yeah, Redecai's $35 buy-in is a lot, and Keyforge's $40 even more so, although at least in the case of Keyforge it supports 2 players, but still, neither of them hold a candle to the single highest buy-in for a single player in a trading card game at $669.98, and that's because you had to buy a console.
Eye of Judgement was a card game co-developed for the PlayStation 3 by manufacturer Sony and Wizards of the Coast that makes use of a special camera called the iToy. You rig this up with a special stand and aim it at a cloth game board, which then registers when you play a card onto it. The problems here are kind of obvious though. Even if you already owned an at the time still $600 PlayStation 3 console, which I don't, so I'm having to borrow footage here, a $70 initial buy-in for a single player is still a lot when talking trading card games. Also, how do you handle local events where players show up to swap cards and play each other? Are they supposed to pack up their entire entertainment center and bring it with them? It seems kinda silly to use physical cards in a game where all of your interactions are digital. Okay, here's the thing. I know exactly why this game is the way it is. You see, in the years before Eye of Judgment was released, there was this huge wave of card-based arcade games in Japan. These are games where you load up your collection of physical cards, either into a deck slot or onto a special table, pay a couple of bucks, play a game for about 10 minutes, and at the end you get another card. These were everywhere while I was in Japan, and I actually stumbled across a few ditched collections while I was there, so I managed to get my hands on everything from soccer cards, to Gundam cards, to wrestling cards, to real-time strategy cards, to cards for a game called Quest of D. Giggity. A lot of these sorts of games are still around, and odds are good you've heard of things like Dragon Ball Heroes or Pokemon Batrio. Heck, the Yokai Watch 3 Dream Medals are designed to work with one of these machines too. Eye of Judgment was clearly designed with this sort of experience in mind, but with one big problem. Arcades aren't really a thing outside of Asia. Japan in particular still has a very lively arcade scene where people play big, flashy games to show off their skills as a daily habit, popping in to play around on the trip home from work or school rather than only for special occasions as arcades are treated in America. It's why in Japan there are entire buildings filled with these sorts of games, while in America you're lucky to have even seen a Yu-Gi-Oh! Dual terminal. So, of course, we have to make do with the next best thing, home consoles, which, while more accessible to Americans, has a much higher upfront fee and loses the environment that's filled with people who you can interact and trade with. 'Cause that's the thing about a game like Eye of Judgment. From a design perspective, it's cool, ambitious, and different. But from a publishing perspective, it's like, oh man, how am I gonna sell this? It might have had a chance, but once digital-only games like Magic Online and Hearthstone started to appear, the odds of anything like Eye of Judgment ever happening again is basically gone unless every console comes packed with a camera as standard. And even then, the convenience of digital-only games will always have the advantage. Not to say that there are no merits to Eye of Judgment's designs. It has a lot in common with later digital games like Hearthstone in that it spends its time tracking a lot of volatile effects such as current health versus max health, the elemental planes on the field and their effects, and firing up and resolving various effects with little effort. There are even some cards that have no text or images on them until they get scanned into the game, which causes things to be intrinsically tied to the game itself. I mean, I guess you could reconstruct Eye of Judgment in real life, but there's so many things to keep track of that the video game just streamlines so easily.
To which I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, wait a minute, wouldn't giving Eye of Judgment a tabletop version that you can play without the video game solve a lot of its problems? Well, no.
Because here's the thing, if you could play this game without buying the big expensive video game, why would you ever buy the big expensive video game?
A lot of people proposed this as a solution to the toys to life genre as well, making the toys that connect to the video game an optional component. Well, you can ask Lightseekers and Starlink how that went. Turns out that when you make the toys for those games optional, nobody will buy them. I got this Starlink spaceship brand new for $1.
$1.
It goes back to a line I've used before, never compete with yourself. And having a version of your game where you don't need to buy the big expensive video game part of it ensures that nobody really will. And that sure is a lot of time and money put into development that's going to waste right there. If somebody wants to make another video game that operates with physical components, they'll have to make that interaction mandatory. Neither of these components can be given the luxury of being optional. Sounds harsh, but it's true. All this talk about overcomplicating the game reminds me of the fact that you can in fact go too far in the opposite direction in an effort to pursue the dream of the so-called immaculate game, where the only thing you need to play is the deck of cards themselves, no dice or anything. I mean, it's kind of the dream for a lot of game designers, and if you can get it to work in a way that's engaging and deep, then good for you. But it has also often led to a lot of lame life decking or rock, paper, scissors games. Don't forget, this episode is called The Deck and Some Dice. If there is one additional component that you should not be afraid to add to your game, it's dice. Because here's the thing about dice. Everybody has dice. They are literally the most common game piece in the world. You can find them in toy stores, game stores, bookstores, teaching supply stores.
My best kept secret.
And, at least in my country, you can buy sets of 6-sided dice at the freaking grocery store. Dice are extremely flexible, as they can be used as a reminder token, randomizer, and a counting tool. Consider games like Pokemon or Magic, which tend to work just fine with the cards themselves, along with 1 or 2 things to monitor stuff like player health or damage. Pokemon, you just need the cards, a handful of 6-sided dice to track damage, and maybe a 2-sided poison burn marker per player if necessary. Now, while in Pokemon each starter deck includes paper damage counters and a flip coin instead of dice as a mixture of tradition and being easier for new players to understand, do keep in mind that the Elite Trainer boxes, special sets intended for more advanced players, ditch all of that stuff for a clutch of dice instead. Magic the Gathering, Ikoria notwithstanding, tends to just need the cards and perhaps a spin down counter for your life total. They might also need a handful of dice in case +1/+1 counters or token creatures come into play. Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, you kinda need a calculator for that one, or a D10 and a set of percentile dice if you're feeling fancy. Though, when it comes to organized play, most games with life points require you to track your health via paper and pencil anyway, and those are even more readily available than dice. Either way, most games tend to keep it simple, tracking cards by position or location as often as with a sort of counter or dice. There's a reason why so many games have card effects that only last until the end of the current turn, so that you only have to keep track of such effects for that long. Same goes with card placement, facing, or location. They track themselves so the players don't have to deal with so much data at once. Although Yu-Gi-Oh! Again has a nasty habit of giving cards permanent changes which require all sorts of tracking for live play. As a Fortune Lady player, I know how bad this can get. But coming back to Keyforge, a handful of dice doesn't really solve its problems, as there are just so many different vectors which couldn't be kept track of without the same variety of dice as tokens we started with. Although, while we're on the subject of games with a tactile experience, I figure it might be a good idea to bring up a number of games that actually include additional components that, rather than acting as trackers that are kind of a burden to use and carry around, they actually interact with the game state and can actually make the game fun and more exciting. Now, I do confess I am a bit biased in favor of these kinds of games, as one of them is what got my channel off of the ground, but what I'm talking about are trading card games that incorporate the skill challenge. A skill challenge is when you have to perform a physical action during your turn. The most obvious example of a skill challenge would be Bakugan's rolling mechanic. You don't just pick one of your Bakugan characters and place it out onto the field to fight, you actually have to roll it from your side of the table onto a little patch of magnetic cards, which it then grabs onto and opens, conferring a bonus. Another example, and probably my favorite obscure game, is Battle Claw, where players scatter some little plastic figures called Jinlins onto the table, which they then grab with a little crane game claw. The Jinlins that you grab then act as the currency you cash in to perform actions during your turn.
Okay, I can sense a lot of you sneering at me right now, but hear me out. If you have a game that uses dice rolls to determine what actions you can do that turn, and you get a bad roll, then that's just bad luck, isn't it? But if the reason that you lose out on a lot of the things you can do on your turn are because you flubbed a skill challenge, well, that's your fault now, isn't it?
A good skill challenge is quick to set up, brief, and, importantly, allows a high skill ceiling. If you flubbed your skill challenge, that's a place where you can practice and improve, removing the luck from that element and replacing it with pure skill. You can't really practice getting better at rolling random dice. Gamers love eliminating the luck from a situation, and a quick game mechanic that rewards player skill certainly appeals to a not insubstantial cadre of gamers. In Bakugan, this manifests as a combination of skillful core placement and improved technique. Bakugan proved to have a skill ceiling so high that it took the game's own designers completely by surprise, which means that a lot of the cards they had released that were balanced in the theoretical scenario of rolls going wild all over the place and grabbing random cores are crazy overpowered in the hands of precision players. But, and I must emphasize this, the skill challenge must be tied to the rest of the game. Bakugan's rolling determines the bonus you get in battle, and the critters in Battle Claw aren't just random. Specific ones let you build more powerful monsters. It also can't be a thing where we step aside to play something else, like throwing a ball into a cup or something. The skill challenge has to directly engage with the game's mechanics. And they must be brief, like it takes as long to perform the challenge as it does to roll a couple dice. We don't want something so intricate that the opponent has to be kept waiting. And to bring this thing full circle, just another reminder that card game players don't like lugging around a ton of extra stuff, so the pieces need to occupy less space and can be set up anywhere without the need for a board. Bakugan has a central core onto which the rest must be added, and Battleclaw has little border cards meant to be placed at the corners of the play area. You can shambles it together like any other card game, no board required. So how can I say that these designs are good while going off on Keyforge earlier? Well, Bakugan and Battleclaw don't lie on their boxes, first of all. Battleclaw had a one-player buy-in of just $15, along with plenty of other ways to get the components in the form of critters and tokens from a variety of products. Bakugan's $30 one-player buy-in, however, I have had plenty of words about these in the past. I'm not a huge fan of them either, believing they should either contain better cards or cost $5 cheaper at least. But fortunately, again, one can build a deck out of components bought independently, and they even recently rolled out a sealed format where they sell a blind box for $10 that contains 1/3 of a deck. There's also the fact that, unlike the massive pile of tokens used in Keyforge which are used to represent card effects, the Bakugan and Jinlins are integral game components which have their own influence over the game and, more importantly, track themselves. They're a part of the fun without being cumbersome and oversaturated the way a board game component might be, as there are roughly only 6 to a dozen of them in play at any one time. I have to stress though, these kinds of skill challenge games are outliers. Outliers that actually tend to appeal more to younger audiences, so if you can't come up with something that's just as simple, well-integrated, and self-tracking as something like this, you might wind up like Dragamons over here, where the toys actually have no reason to be there. Not to mention, making a game with additional 3D components makes for a conundrum when producing expansion products like booster packs. Throwing something in that isn't a flat shape will cause your packs to bloat and risk damaging the cards inside. Not to mention cost more to produce and take up more real estate at the stores you will try to sell your game to. For a few examples of how these have been done, look to Battleclaw for some good examples, or to Dragamons and Star Wars Destiny for some less good examples. People know that plastic punch cards are still a thing, right? If you really want to add minis or pawns to your game, you know you can use those, right?
Now, I have seen and heard a number of proposals on places like Kickstarter about a trading card game that involves moving the cards around on a field as though they were game pieces. First of all, again, if you've done that, what you've made is a board game, not a card game. Secondly, other game companies have already tried this. Remember Dungeon Dice Monsters? Remember Dungeon Dice Monsters?
Okay, maybe an attempted spin-off of a popular card game isn't the best example of this, but it does say something that the people who enjoyed the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game had next to zero interest in a board game version. Magic the Gathering Arena similarly wound up in discount stores nationwide. Just to clarify, I'm not really talking about miniatures games where the figures include a card to tell you the special abilities of that figure, which Dungeon Dice Monsters technically is as far as its game pieces are concerned. I mean a full-on game where you use a built deck to control a series of units on a pre-packaged field, or as I have put it before, a board game. And yeah, I'm counting miniatures as board games, sue me. While I have seen some self-contained games like this sold as one-and-dones that seem to get decent traction, I don't think there's really an appetite for a board game TCG. It's a very different sort of mood for each game. Different space and setup commitments, different loads of stuff to carry, just different oeuvres entirely. Although, these are card games, right? What if we were to make the board itself out of cards? You know, like Chaotic? That means folks don't have to shell out the extra cash and storage for boards and stuff. Well, Chaotic actually isn't as cut and dry as you might think it is. Now, there have been games where you set aside a stack of cards to build a game board, like the Exceed system by Level 99, which I hated. But for an actual trading card game, there's NFL Rush Zone. Now, NFL Rush Zone is a game that is similar to Redecai in that it's nothing but bad ideas. But unlike Redecai, where a lot of the bad stuff came about in pursuit of an impossible solution, NFL Rush Zone is... well, let me try to give you the skinny. In NFL Rush Zone, the cards you pull from the packs are incomplete. You have to attach some special stickers. Yeah, stickers, also found in packs to bring them to full power. The characters themselves also have no balancing mechanics, so some are absolutely better than others. This is because the stats of the characters are based on the team's season records, and the Ravens won that year, so... And, ironically enough, probably the least offensive mechanic of all, you build a football field out of 5 cards and a couple of pawns to race across the field to score points. Yeah, it's not a very good game. Honestly, if you really want a card game about football, get yourself a copy of Jukem, it's way better. Because here's the thing, boards made out of cards suck. They always slide around and get out of place, and these cards don't even do anything. They're literally just sitting there, not participating in the game's actions. And cards don't make for good character pawns either. The constant lifting of the cards off of the table to move them around just sucks if your fingernails aren't in good shape. Rush Zone does have this cute little feature where you clip an end zone onto one of the field cards to give yourself a bonus. I like the physicality. Maybe it could be used in a different game where you clip some sort of power-up onto a character card or something. Though doing this too often might damage the cards and you kinda lose the gimmick if you sleeve them, but it still seems like something to keep in your back pocket. Which brings us back to Chaotic. Chaotic is a card game that does have a system of movement like a board game, but there's an important distinction to make. First of all, the field in Chaotic isn't a board made of cards. They're more like a set of warriors in formation. And secondly, every card is a participant in what's going on. And it is indeed possible to play the game without any sort of playmat at all. You just set the armies across from each other and have your fight. Chaotic is not a board game. Odds are good if you're considering making a board game out of cards. I suggest you reconsider. You might find that people will have more fun if you shrink the size of your board and swap out the cards instead for miniature pieces.
The idea of a card game that combines with a few additional pieces is still a very fertile ground full of uncharted territory, but you have to keep a pragmatic mind about it. If what you come up with imposes a heavy financial burden onto new players, or it severely convolutes the ability for players to enjoy that game in many locations, it might be time to scrap that idea or convert it over to a one-and-done board game. And speaking of board games, when it comes to game pieces that move across boards, the token of choice is the pawn for a reason. Keep that in mind, and you can avoid falling victim to one of the 7 deadly sins of card game design.
Mousetrap, I guarantee it's the craziest trap you'll ever see. The first to capture everyone else's mouse is the winner. Just turn the crank and snap the blank and boot the marble right down the chute. Now watch it roll and hit the bowl and knock the ball in the rubber duck tub, which flips the man into the pan. The trap is set. Here comes the net. Ouch! Mousetrap, I guarantee it's the craziest trap you'll ever see.